In 1977, I was working with Vietnam Vets Against the War, VVAW, and I was looking to recruit vets for the organization. Someone gave me David's name and said that he was a guy that was involved in progressive politics, and he was a vet. He was also respected in Cedar Riverside, and that carried some weight back then. Cedar Riverside was the epicenter of Minnesota anarchy, socialism, co-op wars. It was where it was at. And so I went there to seek this fellow out. Over the next 5 years, David and I, along with several vets and non-vets, carried out many actions, protests, leafleting, negotiations with the VA, and other activities on behalf of veterans. On Memorial Day in 1977, VVAW marched into Fort Snelling proceedings saying, "Honor the dead and fight like hell for the living." I know that David would want me now here to say that that battle is as important today as it was then. Today, every day, some 22 veterans suffering from PTSD and other consequences of their military experiences commit suicide every day. And that does not include active duty personnel. David and I urge those here to continue what so many of you out there have already been fighting, and that is this country's continual participation in war. Recruit David I did, but it is also the case that he recruited me, just like most of you out there. I was 32 and he was 30, so there was almost half his life that I missed and I only knew about through conversations and hearsay. Over the last week, I've talked to several people who knew David, people who knew him from the time in Wilmer when he was growing up till he drew his last breath. And I could only talk to a relative few, and of those few, the more I heard, the more I realized I could never talk to enough people to tell David's story. The collective experiences of the human web here is endless. And so I speak here only of my David. I was one of several people who moved into the house at 26th Avenue South in Minneapolis that during the 70s so many other people came through. Being the unmoored man I was, I did move in not too long after we met and pretty much joyfully went about our activities. Some of you out there will recall the backyard bonfires that we fed with the endless supply of detritus that David always collected around it. They roared up to light those many nights, singed the trees, and threatened the very telephone wires. Throughout beery conversations surrounding those fires, we bullshitted, conspired, imagined, laughed, and debated the fate of the world. It sure felt to me like somewhere I belonged. As I talk about experiences like this one, I want to try to use them to bring out some of what and who David was, and what drew so many people to him. And so here I will say what I can say about absolutely no other person I have known in my life, and that is that with the exception of one person, I never knew a person that did not like David Skeie. Never. Such power he had to connect to people, even people who were nothing like him. That one exception emerged out of the flames of those fires, the elderly Mrs. Halberstrom. Mrs. Halberstrom, fate placed on the other side of the fence from those beery, lighted nights. Mrs. Halberstrom hated David Skeie. As I have now hit 71, I well understand why that poor woman did. And I am sorry that we had so little regard for her peace But back then, seeing her as we did, standing in the way of social progress, she was an early example of collateral damage. David, like most of us here today, was lucky to have entered the world after the Great Depression our parents went through, after World War II our parents fought in, after the Korean War, and into a heartland town at a time when America seemingly ruled the whole world. He was born September 5th, 1947 in Wilmer, Minnesota to Reuben and Helen Skeie. Reuben, having served with distinction as a lieutenant in Italy in World War II, came home to become a banker who ran the Candy, Ohio Bank with a steady hand. From all I've heard and from my knowing her, Helen ran the household with an equally steady hand. She came from a long line of Germans and instilled in David the beginnings of his love of all things German. The first time I saw the Candy, Ohio Bank, I was on a freight train with David riding out west. It was my first trip and a repeat trip for David. David Robin would have had an older sister, Carolyn, who died at birth in 1946. The stories told to me through the years, or recently by those who knew David, seemed to me like chapters out of one story, so that they described a person of remarkable consistency. David loved sailing from his earliest days. He used his considerable artistic skills to carve and draw boats, usually sailboats, and to build models of them. With his cousin Barb, he took walnuts, broke them in half, fished out the meat, stuck in toothpicks to kind of boat them up, and then he sailed them in bathtubs, sinks, in toilets, or wherever they would float. For a time, the Skies had a cabin on Green Lake, which juts out from Spicer, Minnesota, and it's a pretty big lake. It's about 12 times bigger than Lake Calhoun. When David was about 8 or 9 and his cousin Barb 4 or 5, he loaded her into the family's little red sailboat and took off. They sailed and sailed and sailed, way out of sight, and eventually a flotilla of boats out looking for them finally found them way out in the lake. This was one of several times when Dave sailed away, and as his good friend Mark Erickson so often pointed out, charting more by his heart and less by his head. While many of us sought acceptance and validity by acting as much like the other kids as we could, and loading up on common knowledge and experiences, David was always different. He was eccentric. No one I talked to could remember him ever anywhere but outside the Pale. Never wore jeans, never was interested or played sports, never latched on to the standard life rings we all clutched at to validate ourselves. Just as we here were used to seeing him in old, dated sport coat, dress shirt, usually wrinkled, spectacular tie, pants, often suspender, usually wrinkled, and sandals, even in November. Those in Wilmer saw him usually neatly and more formally dressed. For a while when he was in grade school, they could be seen out in the streets lugging his violin to his lesson. While so many of us in our teens were Chevy guys or Ford guys or occasional Dodge guys, David was a David. George Halston recalls riding with Dave at the wheel of his dad's new Mercedes-Benz. What could be more perfect for such an admirer of the Germanic Uber culture that had come down from his mother Helen's ancestry? The radio was playing what? Anyone out there think he was listening to Elvis or the Eagles or the Top 40? No, George tells me he was listening to shortwave radio. London, Berlin, Moscow, the world way outside Wilmer. Any music that would have emanated from those crisp German speakers would have been Bach. Beethoven, Schubert, Chopin, all Johnny-come-latelys as far as David was concerned. George met David in high school at a party. No one I talked to could remember Dave doing much dating. So no, it wasn't a prom, and it certainly wasn't a cater. David wasn't doing that back then. It was a German club party. And ironically, many years later, his friend Jeff Dish met David for the first time at a German club. Dave looked forward, George says, to being an old fart. And he has seen Dave, as he has seen Dave over the years, George sees him as the least changed person he has ever known in his life. Where did that come from? Hard to say. It just felt right to be Dave. I recall him talking on different occasions about his dad out in the garage shooting the breeze with Norm Tollickson. And yes, that was his name, Norm Tollickson. I think Harrison stole it from Dave. And listening to the talk and the banter and the good-natured jibes. And I think he saw these aging men as models of the grown-up that he wanted to be. And as an attender of 30 years of hoplite gatherings, I think he got those models down the path. Wherever it came from, however, it was clear that from the earliest times, David was eccentric, for the fun of it, for how naturally it came to him. Yet eccentric is only an aspect of David back then as a boy, and only an aspect of him throughout his life. David was authentic, and that is who he always was. I did not possess authenticity. One morning in 1924, when my dad was 8 years old, he woke up to find that his mother had left and taken his daughter, his sister, with her. And he left my dad to reside with an alcoholic father. I can only imagine the depth of the hole left in my dad, and how angry he was that he could not ever fill that hole. I never met one of my mother's 8 sisters and brothers, nor, of course, any of my innumerable cousins. Neither I nor my brother Steve remembers the other having been in the bedroom we shared for 7 years. We were an atomized family. Much of who I was, I embedded, and I didn't do a very good job of it. One night after I had known David for about a year, I confessed to him that the four-square guy that he knew, the leader of Vets, was a big fake. I told him terrible things I did, things that no one else knew of. I told him what a struggle it was to hold steady, to fill the holes. Dave looked at me and he said, "Ed, you're an angel." I couldn't ask for a better friend. He told me what he saw, what he experienced, and it was truly the first moment of a healing process that still goes on. David was the most pathetic person I ever met, and he had just told me that I was an all right guy. That felt good. There is so much of David's life that's a guess on all our parts, and will remain so forever. What was it about this man that caused so many of us to love and admire him, to be so attracted to him? He is the most attracting person I ever met. His authenticity does not seem to me to have been whole cloth, as if some may have all answers that they find in Christ, or the child is growing up admiring the stars and becomes a scientist who charts them. He was clearly conflicted, as most of us are. He loved learning about history, but perhaps did not have the academic take on things that might have made the study of history paramount. He was studying in a history in a world that he thought was unfair. And perhaps he saw contradictions in the path to tenure and the single-mindedness it would have taken to become an academic don. He could not hold back from the causes that supported how he understood the world. In Unity Theater, performing in the Cradle Will Rock, he found resonance in the themes of corporate greed and corruption, and sympathy for the common man and the little guy, and maybe identity. This authentic man identified with veterans who had been used and thrown away, farmers where power lines were stitched across their lands, fellow janitors whom he knew in the full sense as persons, treated as components in the university construct, fellow union members who wanted union out of their union. Dreamer or crusader, I think these stances were natural to his authenticity, as was his support for third-party candidates, the source of several arguments I, the pragmatist, had with him, or his support of such outliers as Jesse Ventura, whom he felt was a better choice than those politicians I once heard him describe as the usual suspects. And of course, he loved Bernie. I wasn't for Sanders then or later. Yet after attending a rally with Kathleen and David left me no choice but to go home and donate $100 to Bernie Sanders and send him the receipt that I had done so. Such was my respect for David and what underlay his beliefs. Most of us had our disagreements with David. We saw him battle weaknesses of drink and smoke, as many of us did, yet we still could not help being drawn to it. I think David Skeie was our true everyman, the Homer Simpson who offered us the adventure of going along for the ride with a singularly unique guy. The pull we felt toward him, what he thought, what he wanted to accomplish, was so strong for so many of us as to deny what little reason we had. He did not contract to have his basement put in. He offered us the adventure of helping him dig it. We helped him jury-rig a 50-gallon drum to heat his house, helped him set it up in the living room, and figure out a way to catch most of the falling ashes before the rug ignited. For his garden wall, David scrounged the bricks and bought only the concrete mix. We dug the sand out of the mix, for the mix, out of the garage floor, and then helped him shore up the floor against the hole we dug. We lent him a hand in jury-rigging that boat time and again, then sailed it with him into wind-whipped Leech Lake at night, no lights, some literally fearing for their lives. Some of us spent nights with David freezing on islands into which we had run aground to be ignobly towed back in by a fisherman for $20. And we did it again. Barely managing to make it back with mainsail and jib literally ripped out. We brought him our compost in 5-gallon pails. We gave him our clothes. We drove him wherever he wanted to go, lest he would be forced to use his own car. We railed at him as he pulled hundreds of nails, straightened them for reuse. We went out to eat with him with his free meal coupons when we weren't even hungry, and then paid for the meal when we found that the coupon was months out of date. We brought him beer on one of the last days of his life, and were overjoyed when he opened his eyes and he went, Over and over, I have heard from those who knew him. I feel lucky to have known him at all. The engine behind Gilbert and Sullivan, I loved those parties. Farewell to true treasure. I'm sick with sadness. One of the most generous people imaginable. I've never known anyone remotely like him. I have never known anyone remotely like him. It is a hard world that would take such a person so quickly from Kathleen, who loved and cared for him so deeply, so quickly from so many who have loved and admired him. He came home from the lake sick on September 4th, the day before his 69th birthday, and he died 11 days later. All of us, more or less, one time or another, struggle with getting through this world. All of us can be fragile and afraid. All of us seek love and understanding. David begrudged only hypocrisy, not the sincere beliefs people hold to endure life that takes those we love away from us and then takes us. Thoughts, prayers, tears, offerings, coming together, sharing sadness for David, for Kathleen, for ourselves, for our loss, all have been offered and welcomed here on David's Day. What I turn to, and what I think David would have turned to had he been the one who lost, is that group of people who stand before me now. David Skeie does, in fact, remain. Many lives are different. Our lives are different. For his having been in this world, he will play some part in the way you think, whether you like it or not, in the way you feel, and in our efforts to be authentic people, true to ourselves and others. Because we lost him, I believe we will hold dear to others. Because we could have known him better, we will know others better, lest we lose them when there was so much more there for us. Today we are all part of David's weapon, and so each other. That's as close to religion as I can get, and I suspect David. At this time, I'm where I need to be, and I thank all of you who are here with me. In writing this, I was very much aware of what a tiny little piece of David's life I could talk about. And I so look forward to folks who can stand up and also talk about how they love this man. I love David Skeie, and he will always remain with me. Thank you very much.